Chronic total occlusion, CTO, is the lesion in which a coronary artery that is completely occluded is left untreated for more than 3 months and remains occluded. It used to be an intractable condition that could only be treated with bypass surgery. PCI treatment is now mainstream, with a success rate of more than 90%. Against this backdrop, there have been major improvements in devices that result in successful treatment, and physicians have continued to put their efforts into achieving progress in medical treatment. In the late 1970s, Dr. Andreas Grunzig in Switzerland performed PCI on a human being for the first time. From the following year, live demonstrations were held annually in Zurich with the aims of familiarization with and widespread use of PCI, and these were joined by physicians from various countries, resulting in global acceptance of the future potential for PCI. In the early 1980s, on the basis of activities by Dr. Grunzig, who was invited from Switzerland to Emory University in the United States, PCI became widespread, especially in Europe and the United States, primarily for treating simple lesions. Later in the early 1980s, Dr. Grunzig investigated the feasibility of achieving the additional indication of multivessel disease with complex lesions. In particular, the need to apply PCI to CTO was discussed. Physicians used the Magnum-Mayer wire developed by Dr. Bernhard Mayer and Rotax developed by Dr. Kaltenbach. In Japan, a few physicians, including Dr. Kazuaki Mitsudo and Dr. Osamu Kato, used the standard steerable developed by USCI for PCI treatment of CTO.
PTCA devices were extremely primitive at the time. It wasn't easy for physicians to manipulate the wires in the way they wanted. A very limited number of physicians attempted to treat CTO with PTCA in Japan. And when they did, it was just a matter of, well, we gave it a try. So naturally, PTCA did not have a particularly good track record in treating CTO in Japan, and physicians didn't expect much of a success rate with the procedure. Furthermore, even if the wire passed CTO lesions, they were using balloon dilation, and the rate of reocclusions or restenosis using that technique alone was extremely high. At the time, approximately half of the cases resulted in reocclusion. For these reasons, very few people were willing to attempt PCI with CTO.
In the early 1980s, USCI developed standard steerable, a 0.016-inch PCI guide wire. With a propeller coating, this guide wire had poor torque performance and tip-shape memory, and therefore broke down readily inside CTO lesions. In the mid-1980s, a CTO device development boom took place. The devices developed include Rotax from Osipka, vibrating wire, RF wire developed by Dr. Serais, and Magnum-Mayer wire from Schneider. However, they were ineffective for treating CTO, so the momentum of the first CTO treatment device development boom declined. In the late 1980s, a guide wire series to make manipulation by physicians fully possible was developed by ACS and improvements in PCI guide wire manipulation techniques then finally became possible. At that time, the high-torque standard wire that enabled manipulation with excellent torque performance and high tip load had a diameter of 0.018 inch, and one with a diameter of 0.014 inch was developed later. However, at that time, it was considered highly dangerous to use wires with stiff tips inside the coronary arteries, so few products of this series have been sold. And they have scarcely been used by physicians other than Dr. Jeffrey O. Hartzler. In the late 1980s, the spread of non-ionic contrast agents in Japan enabled simultaneous angiography, thus enabling imaging of occluded loci and visualization of the occlusion morphology. In addition, digitalization of X-ray devices enabled the occlusion morphology and precise position of the wire tip to be confirmed intraoperatively, and the resulting dramatic improvement in wire manipulation techniques has provided a basis for advancement of PCI treatment for CTO.
Prior to this, it had been extremely difficult even to just see the fine movements of the wire tip. Since it wasn't also very easy to see it repeatedly, the advancements made in wire maneuverability had been extremely limited. It was in the late 1980s that the situation finally improved. When non-ionic contrast agents came into wide use, the simultaneous angiography I mentioned earlier became possible. The other factor was digitalization. That played a decisive role in the development of CTO treatment techniques to come.
In 1990, Dr. Takahiko Suzuki, Dr. Hideo Tamai, and Dr. Osamu Kato, with the aim of revolutionizing PCI for treatment of CTO, took what was considered unacceptable practice at that time, in that they were keen on using a 0.014-inch diameter wire, high torque standard from ACS, and thus started the main challenge with respect to complex CTO. This resulted in application of PCI to CTO being advanced to the present state in a single move.
In 1990, Dr. Tamai, Dr. Suzuki, and I agreed to work on improving PTCA for CTO treatment. The three of us agreed to work for a certain period of time to see what would happen if we used the only feasible wire for CTO, which was manufactured at the time by an American wire manufacturer, on all cases, not just a selected sample, no matter how difficult the lesion or how difficult the morphology of the lesions. I think this was in fact the most significant springboard for improvements to CTO wire technology. The idea of manipulating a wire with an extremely stiff tip inside a human coronary artery had been considered taboo. By daring to break this taboo, we could look at how the physician would need to manipulate that type of wire, particularly in terms of methods of operation, and how to deal with complications when they arise. Under these circumstances, we had the conditions we needed to learn these things. I also started out that way in 1990, which improved PCI treatment for CTO dramatically.
It was shown to be possible using high torque standard from ACS to open, by means of PCI, complex CTO lesions that had been occluded over a long period of time, thought to be impossible at that time. However, for improvement of the initial outcomes, it was considered an absolute requirement for wires that they have higher tip load and better torque performance. A visit was therefore made to the United States by Dr. Takahiko Suzuki, Dr. Hideo Tamai, and Dr. Osamu Kato to request Guidant, formerly ACS, to develop guide wires for CTO treatment. However, Guidant turned this proposal down.
In 1990, the three of us, Dr. Tamai, Dr. Suzuki, and I, agreed that the only wire feasible for use on CTO was one sold by an American manufacturer. However, we faced some major limitations even with this wire. One was that although we say it had a 1-to-1 torque, the torque response was not particularly good. Another was that the wires would quickly become damaged. The core of the wire was not made of steel with high tensile strength. Therefore, once the load exceeded a certain limit, the wire would deform. This greatly impacted how the wire could be manipulated. The three of us understood very well at the time that there was a limitation of the wire. I think it was in 1991 when the three of us went to the US to ask the wire manufacturer directly to develop what we needed. The reality was that the manufacturer was more concerned about the risk involved in developing wire for CTO treatment, and they didn't really listen to us.
実際上はですね、そのメーカーも CTO 向けに CTO のワイヤーをですね、開発するというそのリスクそのものの方が彼らにとっては懸念材料で、なかなか我々の言うことは聞いてもらえなかったということがあります。
In 1991, the world's first live demonstration with CTO as the main theme was carried out at Osaka Medical Center for Cancer and Cardiovascular Diseases. During fall of the same year, this course was also carried out at Toyohashi Medical Center, and Dr. Nicholas Reifert participated. Exchange of techniques and information with physicians from Europe and the United States subsequently became frequent. BARI study, a large-scale multi-center randomized study of the initial and long-term outcomes of coronary artery bypass grafting and PCI, was started in 1988, and the screened subjects' background factors were published in 1991. According to that report, 68% of the patients with multivessel disease had CTO, and in 70% of screened subjects, the presence of CTO was the reason for selecting CABG rather than PCI. It was thus again recognized that CTO must be obtained as an additional indication for the use of PCI to become more widespread. The second CTO device development boom took place on the basis of the BARI study. The products developed include the following: Choice Guide Wire from Boston Scientific, Shinobi Guide Wire from Cordis, Crosswire from Terumo, Prima Laser Wire from Spectranetics, Safe Cross System from Intraluminal Therapeutics, and Frontrunner from Lumend. In 1992, Dr. Osamu Kato was not satisfied with the torque performance and tip durability of the CTO wire from ACS and concluded that improvements had to be made from the stainless steel material. Therefore, focusing on the high elasticity and rigidity of the principal initial stage wire products of Asahi Intech, and their cores being more nearly circular than those of other companies' wires, and stating that if made by Asahi Intech, products may be better than the existing CTO wires. He requested Asahi Intech to develop guide wires for CTO. This led to the launch of Athlete Standard.
Asahi
Intech had a wire called Athlete Standard, which had been developed by imitating standard wire produced by the American wire manufacturer. This meant that it also had performance limitations. We compared the core of the wire made by the American manufacturer and the core of the Asahi Intech wire. Compared to today's wires, the structure of those wires was very simple, with only a coil wrapped around the core so that just by removing the coil, you could see the core itself. You could even touch it. When we compared those wires, there were definite differences. One was that core of the Asahi Intech wire was extremely rigid, like piano wire, and did not easily bend or deform. This was clearly different from the American manufacturer's wire. When I saw this, I knew right away that we could get a better product if we could get Asahi Intech to develop the CTO wires. So we immediately contacted Asahi Intech and asked them to make a CTO wire, explaining what the three of us wanted, and that is how the development process started.
In March 1992, Asahi Intech completed development of the Athlete Series, Japan's first PCI guide wire. It was launched in Japan in 1994. In the collaborative development by Asahi Intech and certain physicians, highly sensitive requirements for greater softness or stiffness of the wire tip were expressed numerically, and the tip load was expressed in grams. As a result, for the first time, the sensation on the part of the physician using the device was converted to physical characteristics. Dr. Isao Kinoshita submitted an article regarding the initial outcome obtained by Dr. Osamu Kato in the CTO Challenge, using CTO wires from ACS and Asahi Intech. It was published in JACC in 1995. This report showed the feasibility of increasing the success rate of PCI for treating CTO, which had previously been low, and it thus had a major global impact. It has since been referenced in various publications. Dr. Takahiko Suzuki started using IVUS a great deal when treating CTO. Using IVUS, it was possible to obtain information about the position of the wire tip inside the vessels, the CTO lesion tissue composition, and the intravascular distribution of these tissues. It thus became possible for a small number of the most advanced CTO specialists to use IVUS to treat CTO. This accumulation of IVUS information made it possible to understand the responses of CTO tissue to CTO wire manipulation, and this has made a major contribution to the progress of CTO procedures in Japan. Asahi Intech received a request from Dr. Takahiko Suzuki to produce guide wires for treating CTO, and collaborative development was then carried out. The request stated that in particular, wires should be made that would cross the difficult lesion, especially with calcification. The coil diameter of the tip was increased, And at the same time that Dr. Osamu Kato's opinions were incorporated, a controlled drilling type wire was developed as a concept, with the importance of torque force emphasized. Miracle was launched in Japan in 1995. The resulting product dramatically expanded CTO treatment by PCI.
That was some 20 years ago. We decided to start by disassembling the entire wire, and because there may have been patents and other issues involved, we considered many different possibilities to develop a different structure. We figured that the rigidity and thickness of the core wouldn't have anything to do with torque. The spring coil would be a problem, so we thought we would not use the same coil. Although we do have it now, we were developing the coil braided with 2 or 3 wires. Or other possibilities, like a rigid core but a tapered design and making the torque as strong as possible. We tried many different designs. That's how it started and how the Miracle developed. We had several candidates for names, but I felt Miracle was the best, so that is the name we went with. However, for the concept behind the Miracle, each of us, myself, Dr. Kato, and Dr. Tamai, had very different ways of operating the wires. We may look at the same lesion, but the stiffness we want and the way we rotate the wire may be different. So there isn't just one type of correct CTO wire. In terms of CTO hardness, it also depends on bending. It may be the same shape and hardness, but it becomes more rigid as it bends. Also, there can be calcium that is invisible to the eye that makes the CTO harder than it appears, much harder. This is typical of CTO, so physicians have to step up or, in some cases, step down as they go along. The fact is that from the concept stage, we were working on different types of stiffness for the wires. Physicians also are each different, and we instructed Asahi Intech from the outset to listen to many different physicians. It meant we ended up with too many prototypes. We had too many, so we had to narrow these down. When we asked Asahi Intech to develop the CTO wire, one of our requests was a high-load wire. It's hard to imagine now, but unfortunately, that type of wire was extremely difficult to manipulate at that time. This meant you'd have to have features of other wires to control the CTO wire. Without a guarantee of wire torque transmission, manipulating a stiff wire in a coronary artery is next to impossible. So the next thing we needed from Asahi Intech was a wire with a strong torque. To strengthen the torque, Asahi Intech tweaked the coil wrapped around the wire and developed a wire structure for very strong torque transmission. This was the Miracle. I remember back then using the wire while working on CTO in a human coronary artery and being extremely impressed. When the wire was later sold outside of Japan, physicians overseas were similarly surprised. However, our understanding of CTO wires at the time was still very basic. So naturally, the wires were developed based on our limited understanding. So they were limited in terms of performance.
In 1996, Dr. Osamu Kato visited Germany as a consultant cardiologist in CTO for Dr. Nicholas Reifert. Dr. Kato met and exchanged techniques and information with 2 physicians who are well known in the CTO field, Dr. Antonio Colombo from Italy and Dr. Bernhard Meyer from Switzerland, and provided them with the guide wire Miracle. It was then decided that Asahi Intech's PCI guide wires would be rolled out in Europe. In a response to a request by Dr. Antonio Colombo in April, Dr. Osamu Kato performed CTO PCI at the Milan, New York live demonstration. It was done at Dr. Colombo's Cath Lab in Milan and was transmitted live to New York. The guide wire used was Miracle. This live demonstration provided the opportunity for widespread recognition in the United States of the existence of a guide wire effective for treating CTO. After this live demonstration, Dr. Martin B. Leon made an emphatic request to Asahi Intech to launch this product in the United States. However, the launch was a while later.
The Miracle was in fact the first CTO wire that Dr. Martin Leon had seen. Dr. Leon did not have much experience with CTO, but of course, he and his American colleagues understood at the time that the PCI market would quickly triple or quadruple once clinical PCI treatment for CTO could begin. Knowing that a wire that could actually open CTO lesions would be revolutionary, Dr. Leon sent me a fax the day after the live demonstration asking us for help setting up sales in the US and wanting to found a New York CTO club. Dr. Leon was under the impression that the live demonstration that Dr. Suzuki, Dr. Tamai, and I had conducted was a CTO club, and in Japan, CTO experts had organized meetings. He wanted to do the same in the US, so he faxed us asking for our help. Naturally, Dr. Leon also contacted Asahi Intech as well. Since I had also received one, I spoke with Asahi Intech, and discussions moved forward quite a bit on selling the wires in the US. Product liability law was an obstacle, though. It was not easy for Asahi Intech to get a foothold in the US market, and talks faded at that time in 1996. Then, about 5 years later, by which time Dr. Leon had set up an American CTO club in New York, that's when the Asahi Intech wires were finally launched in the US. After the live demonstration in 1996, we conducted many live demonstrations in Europe and the US, which is how we demonstrated and explained in lectures the use of wires for CTO. Then CTO wires gradually came to be known. That was the Miracle wire from Japan.
Conquest was launched in Japan in March 1998 on the basis of collaborative development by Dr. Kazuaki Mitsudo and Asahi Intech. It had a great penetration performance with its tapered design, high tip load, and enhanced lubricity.
The Conquest wire has several features. One is its high tip load. It is stiff. There are many reasons for the stiffness. One is that, unlike previous wires, the core is rounded all the way to the distal tip of the wire. Before the Conquest, the conventional wisdom on wires was that the core at the tip, the exact measurements vary, but for a few centimeters from the distal, the core had to be flat rather than round. It was round through the rest of the wire, but for a few centimeters at the tip, it would be flattened to create a flat line. This was the conventional wire structure. Creating a flat tip made it possible to achieve both wire flexibility and transmit torque to the distal tip. That is one of the structures that the American wire manufacturers came up with. It became the typical wire structure common around the world. The structure was not adopted to Conquest wire, and the core was rounded all the way to the tip of the wire. Flattening the core made it possible to transmit torque to the tip and also achieve flexibility. Miracle has the same structure. However, there was also a drawback to this design. Since it was flat, it would easily bend in the vertical direction, but not to the horizontal direction. So when you rotate the wire 360 degrees where the blood vessel bends, and the wire is bent along with it, even if you try to rotate it, the wire doesn't turn. If you really push, it will finally start to turn. It's bent like this, and when you rotate it like this, the wire is already subjected to the maximum load. You add just a little more and the wire suddenly whips. Physically, that's just what naturally happens. This is the definite drawback to this wire structure, especially for CTO wires. This is why even though the Miracle was a revolutionary wire, it still had a definite drawback because it had the same structure as the conventional wires. That was the first improvement with the Conquest. The reasonable solution for anyone who thinks about it would be to create a wire structure with a round core, however. The problem with that is that this core would bend in any direction. What I mean is, when the wire is overloaded, it tends to bend in any direction. What is particularly problematic is when the wire ends up with a 3D deformation, like an S shape. When this happens, the wire cannot be maneuvered at all. That is the biggest drawback. So to improve this, we increased the tip load. By increasing the diameter of the core at the tip, we prevented this from occurring. So from the very beginning, the Conquest was a wire that was destined to be. We couldn't lower the tip load past a certain point, so we had to make the core larger. The result was the Conquest wire. Another feature of the Conquest is that it's a tapered wire. By tapering the wire, the tip naturally becomes thinner. This is, of course, advantageous for penetration. We had known this for a long time, so that is the structure used for the Conquest wire. I think this was probably at the request of Dr. Kazuaki Mitsudo. This change made the difference in maneuverability between the Conquest and the Miracle. In other words, as I mentioned, the greatly improved tractability at the wire's tip. People focus only on how well a wire with a high tip load penetrates as a reason why the Conquest became so widely used later on. But really, this wire realized significant progress in maneuverability. The Miracle has a great deal of torque, but it is a wire that takes getting used to, with a great many idiosyncrasies. So in order to handle the Miracle wire well, you have to have a certain level of skill in maneuvering wires to be able to make the most of it. But the Conquest doesn't have the unevenness in rotation that I mentioned earlier. So it's a wire that is easy for anyone to use. The tip responds in the way you want it to. I personally think that's one of the main reasons why the Conquest became so popular around the world. Once this wire was actively incorporated into the parallel wire technique and it was used in CTO treatment, it had as much of an impact as the Miracle did when it was first introduced to CTO treatment, boosting the CTO success rate even higher.
In 1997, Dr. Osamu Kato and Dr. Nicholas Reifert developed the parallel wire technique for CTO collaboratively. On the basis of development of the Conquest wire, the parallel wire technique was recognized as a more effective treatment method. In 1998, in order to make use of the parallel wire technique more widespread, Dr. Osamu Kato held the first CTO club meeting at Kyoto Katsura Hospital. This meeting has been held in Nagoya every year until now.
When I came back to Japan, I looked at improving the parallel wire technique and did a lot of research on how it could be used more effectively with CTO. I held the first meeting of the CTO Club. The club was to promote the parallel wire technique, and we held the first meeting in Kyoto. The CTO Club continues, of course, but that was how it was founded. When we founded the club, Dr. Mitsudo was working with Asahi Intech to develop the Conquest wire. As part of the development process, Asahi Intech would supply the Conquest wire to me. This wire came to be adopted for the parallel wire technique. The fact that the Conquest wire functions so effectively with the parallel wire technique for treating CTO led to the first meeting of the CTO Club that I mentioned earlier.
In 1999, the second CTO Club meeting was held at the Cardiovascular Center, Kyoto Katsura Hospital, and a live demonstration of CTO procedures was carried out by Dr. Takahiko Suzuki, Dr. Hideo Tamai, and Dr. Osamu Kato. After the live demonstration, Dr. Kato performed the retrograde approach with the collateral channel for the first time, and thus confirmed the feasibility of using the collateral channel as the retrograde approach route.
In the mid-1990s, the idea of using the septal channel as a means of access route in a retrograde method came up, and Dr. Tamai and I talked about this around 1995 or 1996. However, this was just a talk because we agreed that it was a high-risk procedure. However, we did a live demonstration at the CTO Club in 1999, and the patient suffered a reocclusion, not during the demonstration but afterwards, and I had to reattempt the procedure at a later date. At that time, the septal channel was extremely large, and I used the septal channel to access the occlusion site with the retrograde approach. We were aware that the septal channel was the best chance of making the retrograde approach possible for the treatment of CTO.
Although bare metal stent, or BMS, was launched in the 1990s, problems with stent restenosis meant that catheterization was considered to be inferior to CABG. However, in the 2000s, numerous reports of clinical studies carried out using DES were published, and these showed that the restenosis risk, which was high with BMS, had been reduced by 70%. It is therefore clearly possible to improve the long-term outcome of catheterization. It had been reported that DES implantation improves the long-term outcome of PCI for treating CTO, and it was expected that for improvements in initial outcome, revolutionary progress would be made with CTO procedures and its devices. One particular outcome of this was that it became usual for CTO sessions at overseas conferences and live demonstrations to be fully crowded. The third CTO device development boom started in this context. In 2001, the CCT conference, which was organized mainly by Dr. Takahiko Suzuki, Dr. Hideo Tamai, and Dr. Osamu Kato as one of the world's 3 main live demonstrations, was held. Live demonstration of the retrograde approach, to which Dr. Osamu Kato had given attention from the point of view of revolutionizing CTO procedures, was carried out for the first time in the world. In 2003, Asahi Intex signed an exclusive sales agreement for the PCI guide wires with a major healthcare company in the United States, Abbott Laboratories. Miracle and Conquest were then launched in the United States. In 2003, when Asahi Intex PCI guide wires were launched in the United States, Dr. Martin B. Leon held the CTO Summit in New York, primarily for the domestic physicians. The 5 Japanese physicians performed CTO procedures in the conference. The success of these procedures using Asahi Intex PCI guide wires provided them with an opportunity to capture the spotlight. In 2003, as a live demonstration at Toyohashi Heart Center for TCT held in Washington, Dr. Osamu Kato carried out a CTO PCI in the left main trunk using the retrograde approach. After the live demonstration, it was found that the septal channel used as the route for the retrograde approach had been dilated due to the passage of the catheter, and it was surmised that the septal branch had been expanded by the balloon. The principle of low-pressure inflation of the septal channel using a balloon with a small diameter of 1.25 millimeters was established and was reported as the septal channel dilation technique in 2005. At the same time, the concept of controlled antegrade and retrograde subintimal tracking, or CART, was established as a technique for reliable passage through CTO by the retrograde approach.
In 2003, I went to Toyohashi to perform the procedure on a live demonstration broadcast to TCT. This case involved a total occlusion in the left main trunk, and there was a very large septal channel from the right coronary artery. I was able to bring a wire retrogradely and pass it through without a problem. It was a very special case, and I was not generally talking about using the retrograde approach. But this technique was very rare in the Western countries, so they were extremely interested in seeing it demonstrated. But more than that, after passing the wire through the septal channel, you of course have to bring the catheter in from the right coronary artery. After the demonstration ended, all the catheters were removed, and of course we took an angiogram. The angiogram showed the septal channel, which had been quite large at the start, had been further enlarged due to the daughter effect that occurred when the catheter passed through. Seeing this, I thought we might be able to dilate the septal channel. So that is where we began the attempt to figure out how to dilate the septal channel. At the same time, no one understood why a bilateral or bidirectional approach worked better for passing devices through CTO lesions. Of course, coronary arteries and iliac arteries have completely different diameters, so it's difficult to imagine using the same mechanism for both.
In 2004, while treating CTO at a hospital in Nara, Dr. Osamu Kato had an experience with a case involving wires inserted in the antegrade and retrograde directions, forming knuckle-like shapes and meeting in the subintimal space. Due to the knuckle-like shape of the retrograde wire, a communication aperture between the subintimal space formed by the antegrade wire and the distal true lumen was expanded, enabling the antegrade wire to be passed through easily. This case was taken as the prototype of CART technique.
There was a relatively young patient at a hospital in Nara. For the treatment of CTO in the patient, we used the retrograde approach and inserted wires from both directions, and the wires became knuckle-shaped. Because of the knuckled wires, the subintimal dissection space was dilated from both directions in the coronary artery. However, since we were using the knuckle wires from both directions, the subintimal lumen was automatically communicated. The wires just passed through on their own. So with the subintimal lumen, a double or triple lumen wasn't possible. Once it's done, it can only be made in that particular spot. In other words, I realized that if you made subintimal lumens in 2 or 3 places, they would automatically link up as they were dilated. The CART technique was established based on this realization. Of course, IVUS was increasingly being used in CTO treatment, and we knew enough by then about what was going on inside and what the lesions were like that it was possible to develop the CART technique. In about 2002, Dr. Osamu Kato had the idea of treating CTO using an OCT imaging wire and requested Asahi Intech to develop a penetration catheter for making a hole in CTO lesions. The resulting product, Tornus, was launched in 2004. In September 2004, Fielder was developed and launched as a guide wire with a wide range of effectiveness. It shows improved torque response, lubricity, and vessel selectivity. In 2005, Dr. Osamu Kato initiated a registry for a study on the experimental treatment method targeting 300 cases. And with this experience, he gave the first lecture on the retrograde approach at CCT in 2006. This was attended by numerous United States and European physicians, and it was the starting point for its global expansion. On the basis of his experience with CTO treatment using a retrograde approach, Dr. Osamu Kato considered that for this treatment method to become widespread, such devices are needed: a channel dilator, later Corsair, a catching device, and an exclusive use guide wire that passes through collateral channels, later Fielder XT. At several conferences, he expressed the need for development of such devices. Dr. Osamu Kato requested Asahi Intech to develop a channel dilator, which was later Corsair. In 2006, following the request of improving Fielder to achieve a better retrograde approach success rate, Fielder FC was launched as a product in which tractability is prioritized, together with tip flexibility and high supportability. After the launch of Fielder FC, it was used for the retrograde approach via collateral channels. After the launch of Fielder FC, the technique for passing through the collateral channel was improved, and progress was made with the spread of CTO treatment using the retrograde approach. At the same time, Dr. Etsuo Tsuchikane started a registry for a study similar to that of Dr. Osamu Kato, and on the basis of both registries, it was confirmed that the retrograde approach markedly improved the CTO treatment success rate to at least 95%. They collaboratively published the pioneering trial results on the retrograde approach. In January 2007, the founding meeting of the Euro CTO Club was held, with Dr. Nicholas Reifert as the promoter,
and Dr. Osamu Kato and Dr. Hideo Tamae were invited. At that meeting, Dr. Osamu Kato performed a case using a prototype channel dilator, later to become the Corsair, at a live demonstration. By 2007, the retrograde approach as a technique was nearly fully established, and we had reached certain conclusions on how to use this methodology effectively. About the channel dilator, it was just at New Year in 2007, I think, when the Euro CTO Club held its founding meeting in Hamburg, Germany. Dr. Tamae and I were asked to go because they wanted to do a live demonstration. The Euro CTO Club was founded by Dr. Nicholas Reifert, and the two of us were asked to go and perform the procedure. The channel dilator arrived just in time. We brought it with us and performed the technique using the channel dilator. As I mentioned, the technique itself was extremely complicated prior to 2007, before we had an actual channel dilator. There were all sorts of problems. The catheter had to be repeatedly inserted and removed. Multiple wires had to be used. While moving the catheter into the channel, the coating would come off and the catheter would stop moving altogether. But just by being able to use the Corsair, most of these problems were solved in one fell swoop. With the Corsair, we felt like it was solid enough to be used as a technique by physicians around the world. It was brought to market around 2010. That was the background, and we wanted this technique with the device to be widely used not only in Japan, but also in Europe and the US, so we worked very hard to introduce it. In 2007, the Euro CTO Club was established. At that time, with the spread of retrograde approach and DES, PCI treatment to CTOs were socially recognized and became widely accepted in the world. Asahi Intech received from Dr. Osamu Kato a request for development of a polymer-coated guide wire for exclusive use in channel tracking, and that can be manipulated in fine blood vessels and tortuous collateral channels previously impossible to access. Asahi Intech then developed the PCI guide wire Fielder XT, making use of proprietary technology. The launch of Fielder XT established the concept of crossing microchannels using thin wires with high lubricity. This is a wire that can pass through even narrow channels, that is Fielder XT, and Asahi Intech made this type of wire for us. This was the second wire for the retrograde approach. In fact, the Fielder XT wire has played an extremely important role ever since. Fielder XT has a very low tip load, so it is not a CTO wire, it's a soft wire for channel tracking. However, Japanese physicians started using the Fielder XT for CTO, and it actually did a good job of passing through. There was a lot of talk at the time about how a wire with such a low tip load could pass through a CTO site. This is what led to the development of today's CTO wires Gaia and Gaia Next. The wires developed for the retrograde approach taught us this. In 2005, Dr. Osamu Kato requested the development of a channel dilator based on the structure of torus that has high penetration ability. The features required for this were flexible but not breakable, safe enough to pass through narrow spaces with rotational manipulation, and great deliverability and trackability. In response to this request, the engineers prepared numerous trial products. Physicians have also repeatedly tested these products, and successful development of Corsair was finally achieved. The launch was in January 2010. Around 2004 and 2005, I talked with Asahi Intect and asked them to make this catheter. Before this, there was the device called Tonus that had a similar structure, and Asahi Intect had made it. In the case of the Tonus, the entire length of the shaft is made of stainless steel, but a channel dilator would not work well if all the parts were metal. We're going through collateral channels with it, so it is high risk. Ultimately, the surface of the Tonus had to be coated in polymer, or it couldn't be used. A polymer coating is fine, but there was a serious problem. Tonus, of course, is rotatable. The rotation applied at hand, as there is a stainless steel braiding through the entire shaft, is transmitted to the distal tip. However, torque transmits through stainless steel, but the distal tip is of course made of polymer, which means there's a gap between the stainless steel and the polymer. Then tearing at that gap is an issue. That was the first problem we encountered when I asked Asahi Intect to develop a channel dilator. The initial discussions were not promising. There was talk that it would be extremely difficult for Asahi Intect to produce what we were asking for, and that the physical limitations might be impossible to overcome. The reality was that it took more than 5 years to bring this to market, and during that time the engineers worked very hard. If there's a risk that the distal tip could come off, it is extremely difficult for a manufacturer to guarantee a product, and at one point the project was abandoned. However, one of the Asahi Intec engineers we had worked with for a while persisted. He worked very hard and came up with a different structure. His answer was a double-layer braiding, which he thought would solve the problem, and in fact the product was launched in 2007 and named the Corsair. Since 2007, Dr. Osamu Kato began using prototypes of Corsair in an experimental manner and performed the reverse cart technique using an IBIS catheter as a standard method that gives direct vision when crossing the CTO. The registry data for this method have been published. With the launch of Fielder XT and Corsair specialized for channel tracking, the procedure of reverse cart put forward by Dr. Kato was standardized. Device improvements and sharing of CTO treatment techniques through live demonstration courses have positioned the retrograde approach as preeminent in CTO treatment, leading to the standardization of the CTO PCI techniques and the global adoption of reverse cart. As Corsair became more widespread so that reverse cart could be carried out, it became possible to observe the behavior of retrograde CTO wires inside CTO lesions using an IBIS catheter inserted in the antegrade direction. This provided an opportunity for elucidating the mechanism of the CTO wire behavior and later led to the development of Gaia. CART, which is inserting the balloon catheter from a retrograde approach and dilating it from the retrograde, was quickly replaced by the reverse CART. This was completely reversed and replaced by inserting the balloon from an antegrade approach.
This procedure allowed us to bring in a number of devices through the antegrade. From retrograde, you cannot bring in IVUS. At best, all you can bring in is a wire. However, with reverse cart, it became possible to insert an IVUS catheter from an antegrade approach for CTO treatment. When the IVUS catheter is placed in CTO lesions, you can see the behavior of the retrograde wire that is coming in from the opposite direction. When you're actually maneuvering the wire, you can now observe and understand with the IVUS how the wire is moving and how the tissue inside the CTO is responding. We finally understood those two things: how Fielder XT is able to pass through the CTO and how the wire behaves. This was the biggest leap in understanding the CTO since the development of the Miracle, the first wire useful for CTO PCI ever. Throughout the Miracle development process, we had a very limited understanding of the maneuvering and mechanism of CTO wires. And one of the byproducts of the retrograde approach I mentioned earlier is that we now understand the wire behavior and mechanism. The launch of Gaia was in July 2012. Understanding about the movement of CTO wires deepened, and Dr. Osamu Kato and Asahi Intech investigated in detail from square one and collaboratively developed the functions needed for CTO wires. After Fielder XT was marketed, there have been reports of crossing being achieved simply at loci where crossing had previously been impossible, even using stiff wires. On this basis, Dr. Osamu Kato's position is that tip flexibility is highly important in relation to CTO wires. However, the CTO wire tip load and the flexibility of the tip work against each other in conventional wires. A number of Asahi Intech technologies were required to resolve this contradiction, and Dr. Osamu Kato and the engineers worked together on 40 or more trial runs to develop the needed product. The flexible tip makes it easy to change direction even within lesions, which makes it possible for the physician to rationally maneuver CTO wires according to the principles of wire movement. Thus, now it is possible to bring the guide wire along the run line as desired. We have developed a much better understanding of how we want CTO wires to function. In the process, we faced the problem of needing both flexibility at the tip of the wire and torque transmission to the tip. Another thing is that at the same time, we were increasing our understanding of what exactly a wire's ability to penetrate tissue depends on. It was during the development of the Gaia wire that we learned a great deal by conducting a series of bench tests over time with the engineers we were working with. In the past, we had thought that only tip load and torque strength mattered. But we came to understand that it was not these features that the wire required, but something else. In the first stages of developing Gaia, having to combine a flexible tip and torque transmission with the ability to penetrate was a serious problem. The issue was that, like all wires in the past, torque transmission was basically 80 to 90% dependent on the wire core. In other words, the thicker the core, the stronger the torque, and the better the transmission. Therefore, we realized that a structure that depends entirely on the wire core for torque would be impossible to achieve. That's when we came up with Act 1. By adopting Act 1, we were able to solve one of these problems. Another important question was how to achieve the ability to penetrate tissue, even with flexible wires. The tapered wire, like Conquest, offered a hint. From the beginning, we had thought about tapering the wire. However, we gradually realized that tapering only the shaft is not very effective. At a load of less than 9 grams, the thickness of the core in the Conquest wire makes torque transmission extremely difficult, and the wire ends up with a double bend. And we found this was a problem that we could not get around. So, we decided to adopt Act 1. In other words, instead of relying on the core used in conventional wires, we could achieve torque transmission using an unconventional method by inserting the Act 1. For another question on how to maintain penetration ability, we found that tapering just the shaft would not be enough. But why not make the wire tip more pointed? We came up with the idea of sharpening the distal tip, like a thumbtack, to improve penetration. At first, there were pros and cons to this method, but after a great deal of trial and error, as the engineers conducted repeated bench tests, we gradually came to understand what we needed to aim for to make this method feasible. In the process, we arrived at the design used in today's Gaia wire. We succeeded in achieving all 3 important functions of a CTO wire: tip flexibility, the ability to penetrate tissue, and torque transmission. Asahi Intech launched Gaia Next. The X-strand structure was introduced, and development was initiated with the aims of reducing the risk of wire breakage occurring inside hard lesions and dramatically increasing durability. As a result of the development process, torque force was increased and penetration effectiveness was increased, in connection with which the maneuverability increased dramatically. Dr. Osamu Kato stated that the CTO guide wire has successfully achieved one of its objectives. The initial concept behind the Gaia was to develop a wire that would be the first choice in treating CTO. We came close to everything we set out to achieve. It is true that we created a wire based on a different concept than conventional wires, but unfortunately the torque was not yet as strong as it needed to be. So the question of how to improve the torque was one of the development issues that Asahi Intech faced. In addition, after the Gaia wire came to market, the somewhat frequent wire breakage was an issue. The wire core breaks, the coil when uncoiled. This was a serious clinical problem. And because it was a problem, Asahi Intech also wanted to work on fixing this issue. So all of us wanted to focus on the problem. What we came up with is what is now called the X-strand coil structure. Using the X-strand coil instead of a conventional wire coil, we were finally able to resolve a critical problem for the Gaia. This also solved the problem of the coil uncoiling when the wire broke. In my opinion, we finally achieved our original goals for the Gaia with the Gaia Next wire. There are still some issues, but I think the Gaia Next will eventually replace Gaia. I believe that when the use of Gaia Next is more widespread, then we will finally see wires become the first choice for treating CTO.
位置づけがですね得られるんじゃないかなというふうに僕は理解してるんですけど。
When it comes to the development of devices, there are two main approaches.
一つはですね、
The first is used when creating a new technology or a new device with a special mechanism
デバイスが作れますといった場合に、それをどう
and is based on how it can be useful in the medical field.
発想からデバイスを開発するパターンですね。
It is used when so-called startups, especially in the US, enter the field of developing new medical devices with all kinds of new ideas. This approach is commonly used in the US. However, as you may know, it is said that 99% of the devices developed under this approach do not become widely used medical devices. In other words, 99% of this effort is wasted. Only 1% develops something useful in the end. It is that kind of probability, I think. This approach does have its benefits.
一方ではプラスに働いている部分なんです。例えば
For example, there are about 10,000 medical engineers in Silicon Valley.
1万人ぐらい
That is, 10,000 people working on devices that will not ultimately become a product. 99% of the engineers are working that way. This is, in effect, a waste. It's a waste, but we have to maintain those numbers in order to have the 1% who are successful. In other words, we do not get success without that level of waste. We need the people to support it. I mean, 99% of the engineers at one startup will, of course, disappear to another company and start on something new. This is repeated over and over, and in the process, the engineers interact with one another, and the technology is mixed and stirred. This is how innovation is born. But it does mean that 99% of the money invested is wasted. That is one of the reasons why medical devices are so expensive. Then there is another different approach. This pattern is one in which technology is developed based on demand. With this approach, success is, in one sense, guaranteed. In other words, developing products based on demand when people say, "I need something like this," means that the product will be used if it can be produced. In that sense, it's highly efficient. Japan is very good at making things better, making them a bit more convenient. That is one approach to development, and I don't think it is a matter of which is better or worse. But what is critical with this approach is, for example, when it comes to CTO, how well you understand what CTO is all about. Without a clear understanding of what is needed to make true progress in CTO treatment, simply creating a device that is a little better is not going to be a medical advancement. The device developed will vary greatly depending on the developer's goals. For physicians and engineers who want to start developing devices, the ultimate goal, the true goal, has to be higher quality treatment, so it is important that they have a solid understanding of the nature of treatment. In the early days of developing the miracle wire, we understood CTO, but looking back now, our understanding of the mechanisms of wire behavior was very immature, which is why we were only able to develop a wire of that standard. Considering our history of development, I believe by clearly understanding the nature of the subject and the essential characteristics of the mechanism,
そのデバイスを
it directly impacts if a new device can help to advance medical treatment.
特許するということだと思うんですね。
I think it is very important for people who are interested in developing medical devices
やっぱり持ってる
to keep this in mind.
だと思うんですね。ですから
I find the typical Japanese way of developing products that are a bit easier and more convenient,
寂しいから
but nothing more, a bit sad.
まあデバイスをですね
When it comes to physicians and manufacturers collaborating on the development of devices, there is very little foundation for this in Japan.
基盤が日本では極めて貧弱ということがあります。
I think it is uniquely characteristic of Japanese society that there is an extremely strong feeling among physicians, particularly the older generation,
高い使命感
that they have a unique mission. Japan has a universal healthcare system, right? So, medical care is considered a public service, and physicians' mission is to serve our patients. It is very good that we are passionate about this mission, and I think this is why it is accepted by everyone. However, this sense of mission also, conversely, leads to a sense that doctors are special. And why is that an obstacle? Because from the physician's point of view, manufacturers are simply working for their own profit. We see ourselves as working for the public good, and we tend to view manufacturers as in a different realm from this perspective. This has had a massive impact, leading to the lack of collaboration in developing devices that we see today. However, if you look at the younger generation of doctors today, that mindset, which I do think is a good thing, and the mindset that goes with it, is fading in a sense. There's much less of an impression that doctors are something special, which creates an extremely good environment for collaboration with manufacturers. Unfortunately, in terms of Japanese-style device development, manufacturers don't have information regarding, for example, what CTO is or what features the device needs in order to function. The only one who can provide that information is the physician. So without the collaboration between both parties, it is impossible to develop these devices.
ですから
That is why momentum is building to grow the medical device field, and the key to doing this is collaboration.
ここで重要な
I think there needs to be more discussion about the best form for collaboration to take.
もっともっと議論する必要があると
I myself have collaborated with Asahi Intech on the development of their devices, and in the process I have learned a great deal from their engineers, and what I learn inspires more ideas on my part. So without this kind of interactive relationship, it is very difficult to understand the idea behind the devices or their true nature.
デバイスに対して
These devices are not something that can be developed by physicians alone, so I feel that this collaboration between physicians and engineers is extremely important. A major leap forward, CTO wires represent a milestone in medical treatment. Only the collaborative relationships between doctors and device manufacturers working together to share highly specialized expertise could have led to this new device, giving doctors a new promising tool to treat CTO lesions with PCI, which previously had limited treatment. Partnerships between doctors and device manufacturers, focused on the challenges of true medical progress, will guide the future of CTO treatment.